This should be a pretty cool session, and let me explain what we're going to do. We'll talk a little bit about Hollywood Content Lake and what these folks are doing in media workflows with AWS. And we're going to have a really interesting conversation with Warner Brothers and Astro Malaysia. Astro, for those of you who are Western Hemisphere based, is one of the largest broadcasters in Southeast Asia. So we have Warner Brothers, a studio, and their take on what's important in using the cloud. And we have the broadcast perspective, slightly different industries. And we're going to give you enough slides to sort of bring you up to speed on where they're at. And what's interesting about their journey is that they're both sort of mid-journey, right? In the process of still working out some things, but have already made quite a bit of progress in architecting. And so it should make for a great conversation. And with a small audience like this, I think we can have interactive Q&A. It's a little hard to see hands, but we'll try to catch those. And the last third of the session, we were just going to sit and do kind of panel discussion. And again, we can interrupt that with Q&A if you guys have questions about architecture. All right, so I'm Mike Davis, and I'm on the storage business development team up in Seattle, and I connect pretty tightly into the Glacier and the S3 teams. And my focus tends to be on large-scale archive. And so I'm going to kick it off, and I'll let these gentlemen introduce themselves when they get up. And what I want to talk about is sort of when we go out, and we've had notable customers like Fox Pictures and Discovery Channel and Turner and Wazi Digital and Fox Sports and companies of this magnitude moving both their workflows and their archives, their media archives, into AWS, kind of distilling out what are the reasons they give us for moving to the cloud. And we can kind of break it down this way. We can say, hey, we're observing all these new opportunities out there. We see it in in these competitive threats. We see it in different consumption patterns in the market. Okay, that's point one. And the but is, it's very hard for me to turn and react to those market opportunities as a traditional media firm. And there's a couple things that jump out. Number one, I have a big archive, but I don't have enough metadata on that stuff to really get utility out of my assets. Okay, and that metadata may be speech to text, it may be facial recognition, it may be tagging if you're a sports league and you want to tag plays and things like that. The other problem is more infrastructure related, where you have a lot of traditional infrastructure that's kind of rolled together over time, and you have silos of content. These represent kind of roadblocks to consolidating into a single view of assets. And then finally, there's the kind of traditional bare metal serial workflows, people pushing carts with tapes on them down the hallway, and tape-based storage. And there's this paradox of tape where as your asset collection gets big, it's even harder and harder to enrich in that metadata and to get utility out of those assets. And I've heard the example multiple times where, hey, our storage tech silo reached the limit of 5,300 LTO tapes, and now we just rotate them out and put them on a shelf or send them to Iron Mountain. So it's even worse. You're sort of abandoning those assets in a way. And we know that's not doing anything to serve the business going forward when we were looking for more agility. So how do we kind of quantify the benefits of moving to the cloud? Well, there's a lot of conventional things we can think about. Reliability, that's durability and availability. With our economies of scale and our ability to create very high levels of reliability, we arguably can keep your data safer and more secure and more highly available than you could in a traditional data center environment. Our ability to scale in a limitless fashion, our ability to have a very strict and continuing to evolve a kind of a security toolkit for you. Okay, strict is the wrong word, but a diverse and powerful toolkit for maintaining security for your assets. Cost, so up to now, we would say, hey, we're kind of at par with the cost of buying and scaling and maintaining a tape library in your data center. That would be Glacier. But if you saw the announcement this morning, Deep Archive is coming out at 1/4 of the price of the Glacier that you knew before. And so now it's not just about being the same price as a tape library, but even the same price as tapes on a shelf in a vaulting service like an Iron Mountain or something like that. And that's really the goal, is that all that data that's cold and not doing anyone any help by being in a vault should be brought forward and do what we can to get value from those assets. Okay. But I kind of, these are not necessarily arguments for moving to the cloud. These are almost like table stakes things. It's got to be equivalent reliability. It's got to be equal or lower cost than what I have today. What we've kind of learned over the course of time is the things that are really important to the customers in migrating to AWS are these things that relate it to agility, global footprint. Okay, I can't think about being siloed to North America anymore. The ability to automate workflows using serverless, things like Lambda and so forth. The ability to take my legacy archives and normalize them to a new packaging format or a new codec. The ability to augment the metadata and enrichen the cataloging that I have today. These are what I consider to be sort of top-line value propositions. These are the reasons that your CIO, COO say, yeah, now I see the leverage to the business. And so, using the magic of PowerPoint, top line, bottom line benefits, both are important. The bottom line things are the things you got to have in place to make the move. The top line things are the things that you use to justify moving your media asset management, your archives, your workflows to the cloud. Okay, so as a result, we have lots of very interesting customers using us for various parts of the workflow today, including archive. And we're going to focus more on the archive and the media asset management pieces today. That's sort of the core theme of what Warner and Astro are going to talk about here. And I'll close my section by saying one of the other things that we've learned in the process of migrating some of these very large customers to the cloud is the act of moving 20 or 30 petabytes of assets to the cloud is not just a plumbing problem. When I say plumbing, I mean, how do I get bits from point A to point B? It turns out to be a very complicated project. And it starts with, how do I get stuff out of your existing archive and optimize the egress from there? How do I read from tapes? How do I decode proprietary tape formats into something that I can use going forward? How do I extract metadata from my legacy MAM? So these are sort of exporting from the legacy system. Now, when those assets are in flight and moving into an AWS environment, that's the time to look at doing things like creating new proxies, extracting more metadata before it goes sort of cold down into Glacier, right? And so we've created, and we've had some separate sessions on this this week, a fully serverless media migration pipeline. So it's all using step functions in Lambda. It starts with the media asset registry, which is do an MD5, create a UUID, automatic proxy generation using media convert to your specifications. And then triggering our analytics pipeline, which is facial recognition, speech to text. We build those indexes. We're creating a ton of new metadata for you. So now we have to put it in some place where we can persist that data. That's DynamoDB and Elasticsearch. And then we need to package it up for your MAM. And so we have sort of a metadata exchange. I won't call it a standard, but we're working with the MAM vendors on how they want to take that in, if it's JSON or XML. And so these are some of the complexities of the migration that really need to be thought about up front. And then we start to talk about, well, what are the adjacent wins for you guys? So, OK, besides putting the archive in, how do we run Aspera in the cloud and do data transfers directly into the S3 bucket, for example? Or how do we do automated packaging and distribution from your bucket? And then, of course, all the questions around how do you want to assure DR? I think David's going to mention the term Fixity, which is important for sort of long-term preservationists. How do you manage costs using lifecycle? So there's a whole set of best practices around just the operationalizing of that archive. So this is all really should be thought about up front in a methodical, planned migration. And nowhere in here am I evangelizing snowballs. Right? That's the choice of snowball or direct. Those are sort of details of implementation that come out after examining all these issues. So So we're getting much better at taking this view end to end and kind of prescribing based on your requirements, where you want to go, how fast, what are the forcing functions, what are the requirements for metadata augmentation, and helping you build a plan around this. So I'll stop there, and I want to turn it over now to Aik Chong, who is the CTO of Astro Malaysia. And he's going to walk through where they are and what their architecture looks like. OK? Thank you.
Thanks. Can you all hear me? Thanks for having me here. So maybe just a quick intro of Astro. We are the largest media company in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. We have interests across pay TV, content production. We are the largest radio operators in Malaysia. We have e-commerce, home shopping business, and a number of core digital product as well. So from pay TV perspective, we are in 76% of the homes, but Malaysia is not a big country, so we have 7 million homes in Malaysia, so we are in 5.6 million homes in Malaysia, serving 20 over million individuals in Malaysia. From radio perspective, we reach about 15, 16 million listeners on a weekly basis. And on digital products, we get about 20 million monthly unique visitors to the different core digital products we have. And one of the key areas that we have is content production. So we produce about 13,000 hours of local vernacular content per annum, and that's how we differentiate ourselves compared to other international competitors. So on our platform, I would say about 75% of the viewing hours are actually on our own locally produced content compared to the licensed content. From pay TV perspective, let me just do a quick video intro of the facility we have before I go in a bit about what we have done in terms of archiving project.
Oh, I don't know if I can plug it. Nope, it's tough to. You can sing and dance, can't you?
There's a lovely soundtrack.
Yeah. There's no voiceover, don't worry.
And this is an amazing piece of hardware. Actually.
I could watch those tape robotics go back and forth all day long. It's like watching a Zamboni at the ice skating rink. It's like it just wants to crash into something.
You should see the ones in the old days. They used to spin around in circles.
Now, your control room, look, how many channels do you monitor in
It's about 200 channels.
200 channels. That's very impressive.
So the castle-looking building was our is our main campus, and then we have a second site in a place which is about 20 kilometers away. So basically, we distribute our load equally across both sites. So both sites are hot all the time, and it caters for 50% of the service. And obviously, why we have split the service also because of disaster recovery. Over the last 2-3 years, we have been busy upgrading the legacy technology infrastructure across both the facilities, which were put in place. I mean, from technology perspective, those were put in place like more than 10 years ago. And basically looking at how could we leverage on modern technology to improve operational efficiencies, scalability, reliability, and also what is more important is making sure we can get our content to our customers as fast as possible. Both the sites, all the content-related processes are being managed through a media asset management system. And basically this MEM system also controls and manage how content is being archived into the data tape library and also how content is being mirrored across both sites. We have 2 storage stack SL8500 libraries, one at each site. And currently we have about, in total, because we have been in operations for the last 23 years, we have about 600,000 hours of unique content being stored in the archive. And on an annual basis, we are adding about 60,000 hours of new content. So you can imagine it has been quite a challenge to be able to cope with the growth of the content that we have. This is quite a busy slide. I'll just cover a few main points. Our data tape library was installed in 2006, so it's actually quite an old systems. And we do face quite a bit of challenges from day-to-day perspectives. So if I look at the last 12 months, easily we would have experienced like 8 tape snaps over the last 12 months, and that equals to, if you look at total number of hours of content, that's about 500 hours of content that we lost because of the tapes. But fortunately, because we mirror our content 100% across both sides, we are able to recover from the other side. But you can imagine it's a very expensive activity to try to mirror content 100% across both sides. Robotic arm as well, sometimes we also struggle to get replacement part. There was once, it took us 2 days before we could even get hold of a replacement part. The second challenge we have is in terms of SLA, especially we are not able to commit to SLA to turn around a piece of content quickly from getting it out from the archive and getting it either to our pay TV channels or onto our video on demand library. And at times during certain occasions, sometimes it could take like up to 24 hours before we could actually retrieve a piece of content out from the robotic library. And from ongoing maintenance perspective, it has been quite challenging and also expensive as well for us to continuously trying to keep up to the LTO technology enhancements. So if you look at LTO currently, we are at LTO 8 right now, but if you look at in our library, currently we have a mix of between LTO 4 and LTO 5 tapes, and we have not really taken a decision to make sure we are up to date because of the various investment concerns and also the challenges we face with the robotic library. And obviously with 20 petabyte of content, there's scalability issues as well. And like what Mike mentioned just now, so both our libraries are actually full, and then we ended up externalizing 6,000 data tapes sitting on the shelf. So you can imagine the additional manual works and productivity issues that brings to the entire operations. And in fact, 6,000 tapes is as good as a new library. The last couple, since last year, we've been looking at options. Do we expand the data tape library, or should we do something different than what we've been doing? And finally, we decided to move everything to Glazier, but obviously with us proving the business case and making sure there's valid business case before we decide on the move. In fact, we started the migration since late August, and this is a process that's going to take place over the next 6-7 months, and we are targeting for that to be completed by end of March next year. So with the new architecture, what we are looking at, there are 4-5 key areas that we're focusing on. First is to make sure we really improve the customer experience, to make sure we can actually get the content out to our customers as fast as possible, and to make sure we are really the first one who air the content on our channel compared to our competitors. Secondly, with the move, we are also looking at how do we unify and simplify the current complicated and very complex multi-site infrastructure, and also looking at, with that, how could we minimize or reduce the number of points of failures we get from the current system. Thirdly, obviously, from scalability perspective, from reliability perspective, with the move to Glazier, those will be addressed compared to the current storage tech library that we have. And obviously, cost is also an important factor as well. And the aim is for us to move away from the traditional upfront capital-intensive approach to pay-as-you-use, where we only pay for what we need, rather than investing upfront or sometimes over-investing because we are worried and that we may not be able to cater for the load that we put in peak capacity just to try to cater for what we've estimated.
Hey, you mentioned, I was going to ask about your migration, just to clarify, are you using the DX, Direct Connect networking to move all the content?
Yep.
Is that the plan? Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So if you look at previously, we already have a direct connect link from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore directly, because at that time, AWS doesn't have a port in Malaysia yet. So that link is still active. And then about 2 months back, we put in a new link connecting both the sites, each one having a 20 gig pipe connecting both the sites to the AWS port in KL. And basically, with the 20 gig link from each site, the aim is we want to expedite the migration as fast as possible. And thus, that's why we are able to estimate that we will be able to complete the entire migration within a 6-7 months period. And if you look at this diagram, so we have 20 gigs link from each site to the AWS POP. And at the same time, because these are precious content, we also want to make sure in the migration process, if something happened to the link, because sometimes the fiber could be chopped because someone is digging the route for construction, and thus we are still keeping the direct connect link to Singapore as well as a backup. And the plan is once all the content is migrated away from the archive to Glazier, then we will be shutting down the SL8500 libraries across both sites. And this entire process is being managed by the media asset management system we have. So we have added a new Glazier adapter to the media asset management system that's actually driving the entire migration process.
How many tape heads do you have in your tape libraries? How much you're getting pretty aggressive throughput on a 6-7 month run. Are you going to continue to ingest into your tape archives, or are you going to start ingesting directly and then migrate?
We will start ingesting directly. In fact, it will go into our production storage first in the diagram, and then from there, then it will be moved to Glazier directly rather than going to the
and so the tape archives can be turned 100% to egress,
Right.
which is one of the ways to get the throughput up. Okay, all right. Are there, can you go back? Are there any questions from the audience on what he's showing here and sort of the cloud state of their? Yeah, sure.
I'm quite familiar with Elemental yet. You listed it there. What's the function of that part?
You go ahead.
So for Astro, besides providing our service through direct to home through satellite, we also have OTT service as well. So basically, we also send our linear channel and also individual content to the AWS cloud, and Elemental is a service we use over there to transcode and to convert the linear channel and the individual file for our OTT service.
Yeah. And Elemental was a company that AWS acquired several years back, and has been a long time producer of on-prem encoding systems for broadcast and film and so forth. So that's their core, but we have multiple Elemental services for transcode, for packaging, and for playout type of use cases. Question here? Yeah.
Come again, sorry?
As you're pulling the data off your tape drive, were you doing anything to validate the files?
So the media asset management system is actually doing all the integrity check, and is also checking the checksum as well, whatever that comes out from data tape library, and also when it moves into Glazier, so that's being handled by the media asset management system.
Can you share which VAM you're using?
We're using a product called MediaFlex from TMD, Telemedia Dynamics. Any other question, or I move on to the next slide? So from cost perspective, obviously, for me to be able to persuade the CFO that this is something worth doing, so we need to show that, bottom line perspective, there is going to be cost saving. So we set ourselves over 5 years period, at least we want to be able to achieve a 20% cost savings over 5 years period. And I think what is key is to make sure, besides taking into consideration the AWS related costs, for the total TCO calculation, we need to include also the additional bandwidth we need to put in, and also the migration effort, and potentially we may need to engage external party to assist us. There's also software licensing and also parallel run costs as well, because while the migration is going on, I need to continue to maintain the SL8500 libraries as well as the HSM, the software system that's managing the library, and all those are actually costing us money. So that's why we are trying our best to make sure we can get it across as fast as possible. Then we could shut down both the library and also the archive management system. In terms of what's coming after migrating the content into cloud, so the way I look at it is, obviously our operation engineers will move away from the manual, mundane task of maintaining and keeping track of even the data tapes, right? But we'll be moving more and more into trying to automate as much as possible the content-related process. While currently it has been automated to a certain extent, but definitely there's a lot more we could do leveraging on the various services available in the cloud, whether it's native AWS services or it could be third-party services that is available in the AWS ecosystem. In fact, we have started looking at and doing POC proof of concept on applying AI machine learning on some of the more human-intensive stuff that we are currently doing. For example, like subtitling, both from speech to text and also text to text, translating from one language to another language. We are exploring metadata generation of selected content together with a third-party partner. And we are also looking at how we could leverage on, for example, the Amazon recognition service to try to automate content censorship. In Malaysia, we have quite a strict content censorship rules. So for example, on our turnaround channels, we have about close to about 100 channels that we receive from external providers, and then we actually put it on a 1 minute to an hour of delay that we actually have a team of 300 people working 24/7, chopping up content, either stitching content together or inserting content to make sure it looks good. That's a lot of operations involved, right? But that's still a new area that we are still exploring, and we have not seen successful outcome from the experiment we've been doing. From subtitling perspective, we are having some good successes. So by middle of December, we will actually be automating at least the translation service from one language to another language. So we are covering 3 different languages between English, Chinese, and Bahasa Malaysia, which is a national language in Malaysia, right? And I'm actually quite excited with the migration because we could do a lot more on the content that we have. And the ultimate aim we have, hopefully in 3 to 5 years' time, the plan is to have at least 80% of the broadcast infrastructure to be fully operating from the cloud, rather than currently that we have 2 massive broadcast centers to cater for our media-related services. That's it. David, it's your turn.
So that was great. Ik Chung did such a nice job talking about migrations and sort of mechanics of that I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on something that's a little more esoteric and kind of interesting for some folks. So I'm David Sugg. I'm the Vice President of Content Architecture and Engineering for Warner Brothers. So I look after a variety of different content-related systems and processes and media engineering activities for the studio. So just real quickly, in case there was 3 people in the room that don't know who Warner Brothers is. Today, WB is performing at the top of our game. We're leading in major areas of entertainment. We're setting records at the box office with recent hits like Crazy Rich Asians. We've been the number 1 TV studio for the last 9 seasons. We've also built an amazing gaming company through acquisition over the last several years that's generating more than $1 billion in revenue just last year. So it's a big thing for us. It's also home. WB's also home to some of the world's biggest brands, including my personal favorite, Harry Potter. It's one of those things I read to my kids when they were growing up. It's a great brand. We've also got DC Comics, the Wizarding World, Middle Earth Family, among others that you see on the slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the 100-year challenge and what that means to us, to the studios. So for many companies, the data they create supports their business and the creation of their products. For example, an automotive manufacturing company. For other companies, it can be argued that that most of the data they create is their business, but it's not their product. For content creation companies, the data we create is our business and it is our product. And so for that reason, we tend to think in the terms of preserving things for 100 years or more. And that's an interesting problem. We know how to make film in cans exist or last or work for over 100 years. It's a well understood process that's both tested as well as reality has proven that it works. Unfortunately, nobody really knows how to make digital collections of digital bits last that long. And more importantly, last that long in a predictable and low effort manner. Right? We can all stand around and migrate LTO 5 to 6 and 6 to 7 and 7 for the rest of our natural lives. But it doesn't really sound like a great time. So what we really need is the Superman Fortress of Solitude knowledge crystal. If you know anybody that has one of those, let us know. So while preserving those bits for all eternity is certainly the top of mind, it's not really the only consideration for us. We, like many companies, categorize threats to our assets, and we think about things like bit rot and media failure and EM pulses and loss of tribal knowledge and disease and war and zombies, and it just kind of goes on.
Do you have zombies on that spreadsheet? If you do, I want to see it.
If you can read that little tiny spreadsheet behind, then maybe it's on there. But we are an entertainment company, so you got to figure there's zombies in there somewhere, right?
Eat your own dog.
And if not, I'm sure that Brad and I can make sure that they get added. Okay. So each of those things are assessed by probability, against probability and impact, and then they're solutioned for. So, but digital content archives have a special problem in that it is important to ensure that all the bits are always present, and that we're able to repair or replace them if they're damaged or missing very quickly. Technology such as remote replication can overwrite stuff, overwrite good files with bad if they're not managed properly. Excuse me. The insurance, or this insurance of bit status, is called Fixity. Mike mentioned it a second ago. And preservation technologists are, fixated on it.
It's true.
It's true, among other problems. Fixity helps us solve for threats like media failure and bit rot. It also gives us a good understanding of the state of our assets at any given time. Fixity can be managed via checksums, and it usually is, and can be applied at ingest if the fixity is known for the file. So if I know what the checksum for the file is when I get it, I can ingest and check against, right? I can also manage it throughout the life cycle by running regular checks, regular checksum checks, and I can also do it during any event, like a file copy or a file move. So this is an interesting quote. I'm going to read this. Just because I think it explains the concept well. It's from there actually is such a thing. If you're not a preservationist, now you know. The Digital Preservation Handbook, as presented by the Digital Preservation Coalition. Fixity doesn't just apply to files, but to any digital object that has a series of bits inside it, where that bit stream needs to be kept intact, with the knowledge that it hasn't changed. Fixity could be applied to images or video inside an audiovisual object, to individual files within a zip, to metadata inside an XML structure, to records in a database, or to objects in an object store. So this is Fixity. Right? You learn more about Fixity than you ever thought you wanted to know. So every bit's important, and it's not enough to just have 11 nines. You know, Amazon and AWS and others like to talk about the number of nines they can give us of durability, right? That's not enough. Those bits have to be kept safe. Even losing one bit in a file is a problem, because once they're gone, there's nothing we can do about it. So our current standards require us to check Fixity on a regular basis. So that can be monthly, it can be quarterly. It's certainly more than at least once a year, right? Oftentimes more than that. So there's an interesting problem is that cloud providers like AWS provide tools for checking Fixity at time of file upload, file download. And Fixity inside their infrastructure, it turns out, is verified regularly by the tooling that they provide. But there's no way for me to access that data today. There's no way for me to know. And so when you're talking with a preservationist that wants to understand the state of their asset archive, they want to understand what the Fixity status for a given asset is across the thing. When was it checked the last time? What type of check was performed? What was the status? What happened if there was a problem? That's what they want to know. So AWS and other cloud providers have features in their feature requests in their pipeline to add that sort of visibility to that Fixity information, which we want to then incorporate into our archive to help us manage that asset through its 100+ year life cycle. And it turns out it's important to other folks that are really trying to manage that for that really long-term thing. And so this data is really, really important for any serious digital archive, because the alternative is to deploy separate compute processes to validate fixity, and that's expensive. I got to roll compute. I got to read every bit. I have to rehydrate every bit off of Glacier or Deep Archive. I have to read those bits. I have to checksum them, and then I have to trunk them and move on. And that's really just improbable from a cost perspective across a multi-petabyte archive. So, how do we manage this today? Right now, we've got redundant, geographically dispersed colocation sites, so we're fully terrestrial. Think of Ek Chong's diagram. It's similar, SL8500 tape libraries. A mix of T10K and LTO tapes. We perform monthly, quarterly, and biannual fixity checks of every bit in those tape libraries. If we find a bad bit, we replace from a good copy, and we retire that tape. That tape goes away. It's gone. We also age tapes out. So the tapes don't exist in the library longer than a certain period of time. It's defined by our understanding over the course of the years of the aging cycle of LTO tapes. They don't last forever. Typically, we're pulling stuff out at least every 3 years. So a tape is literally just copied off and erased, even if it's still good, every 3 years. And as you might expect, the usual challenges are addressed by moving to the cloud. So the usual challenges exist as well, and Ek Chong talked about this as well. In particular, there's real costs for things like egress and storage, but there's also those perceived costs, costs of compute, the visible versus the hidden cost. I'm sure many of us have been in those conversations about how the tape library is free, because it's a sunk capital cost, and there's real costs for me to run compute and pay for storage every month. And so there's some real issues with that. And there's perpetually in our industry, though it's getting better and better and better, is the question of security. How secure is it, right? And each of those issues can be managed. The cost one. I'm sorry, huh?
Can you click forward one? I think you're on the...
Nope.
Oh, okay, good.
Sure. No, you're right, I am. Sorry. Thank you. Realistic TCO calculations are really important, right? So making sure that you're actually looking at the total cost of ownership for that archive. We are in a particular scenario right now where parts of our archive are actually managed by a vendor, and so that makes it even a step more obscure to us what the actual TCO is on the actual library itself. Another thing that's been really interesting to watch inside of a 100-year-old company is the updating of the accounting methods, right? So in very old companies, managing sort of monthly cost and OpEx against managing capital spend that's seen as a very sort of free money versus not is a real big problem. So the finance folks have been working pretty diligently inside of our organization to get much better at that, and they've made some big strides. And while security issues are real, those of us that are working to move stuff into the public cloud know that they can be addressed with smart policies and smart implementation. The cloud is really great for getting stuff done really quickly. It's also really great for doing stupid things really quickly, so you can fail really fast in a pretty amazing way if you don't do things smartly. So, what does it look like for us today? This is a really high-level view of what we're doing now. So we've got lots of vendors that are sending content into our archive. Companies like, most studios in general, use a lot of outsourced vendors for this kind of thing, for the sort of preparation of content for archive. And that comes in through an ingest process, and then there's a replication that's managed, both at the storage level as well as at the DAM level. And that's actually a complex process. It's actually pretty tough to get and keep right. But the real killers here are the lack of elasticity and the long enhancement cycles. Both classic cloud, public cloud advantages, right? It's simply really, really difficult to scale up or down. It just is. I got a big storage setup. I got a bunch of tape libraries. I need more storage. I need more tape libraries. That's a long cycle for me to get through. Classic sort of cloud arguments, right? So this is what makes the move to cloud so compelling. So we've been working on a cloud-based solution, and this is a variation of what this might be iteration 376 that we're working on delivering. We're actually, as Mike said, we're sort of mid-flight on this journey. Our preservation policies strongly encourage, I'll use those words purposely, strongly encourage vendor diversity, right? They really want us to be vendor diverse. And it makes sense. So we're likely to replicate a copy somewhere else, somewhere besides AWS, but that's represented on this diagram by colo-location 1. That said, it could be a terrestrial facility, might be. It could be another cloud, or could, depending on the scenario, might just be another region within AWS. It's still being discussed with our preservation folks. The replication strategy is still being designed, but you'll notice in front of this stack there's actually a services layer that we're building that's actually standardizing a lot of our processes for intake and output. 1 second. It's going to be an interesting exercise because part of our design ethic has us actually removing the dam, or moving this up above the dam, the replication strategy, not having it be a dam-driven strategy. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are relatively clear, sort of getting to a scenario where we've created services that are decoupled is compelling for us, and sort of pulling things out of a monolithic dam application is very interesting to us. We'll certainly manage our elasticity concerns in this scenario with using cloud resources. So that means the intake comes in through the cloud, that we burst up, slow down, whatever we need to do. Egress is certainly a concern in this model, but there's lots of tools to help us manage that and understand and deal with those costs, direct connects, and other tools that are available. Details on this are still being hammered out, as you can tell, but we're really excited about making this change and getting this thing up in the cloud so that we can start doing a lot of the stuff that Ike Chong laid out in the last slide of his deck. I think all of us are trying to figure out how to better leverage our assets. And this is a big step for us to get to that place. So that's that. Questions? Yep.
I was going to ask, so Chong said before that Astro is kind of cloning data to 2 different locations. Were you also doing the same with your co-location 1 and 2?
Effectively, yeah. It was being managed, or it is being managed as a tape library level action, so an HSM is managing it, the actual data replication, and then there's a data replication that happens in the dam as well.
And by the way, folks, we're going to do a little bit of a panel discussion here, so the session's not wrapping up just yet.
And does your service layer kind of encode which sides the data is on, or I guess my question is, if you're running an application or consumer of that data on either end, in the cloud or on premises, is there sort of a framework that allows you to pull the right media assets automatically from wherever they happen to be?
That's exactly the point.
Yeah, I mean, in our case, we are using the single MAM system to manage whether it's on-premise or in the cloud.
Right. And our challenge as a studio is that we don't have the benefit of having a single pool of assets. So I have assets that exist across multiple vendors, multiple systems, in the cloud, not in the cloud, behind endpoints, not behind endpoints, because as a company that's been leveraging vendors for the creation of materials for a very, very long time, we have a incredible swath of materials around the world, and so we're actually taking it up a layer above that, because there isn't really a dam that we're excited about using that does that direct, specific mapping of assets across that broad spectrum.
Can I follow up on that? Sorry, I don't want to.
Sure.
But have either of you kind of included digital media assets in that workflow, or are we just talking straight kind of video and so on?
No, it's across the spectrum. I mean, we are, as I said, we have $1 billion a year game company, right? And so we're looking, ultimately, we're looking at every kind of asset that we create. We create millions upon millions of advertising and publicity materials around everything that we release every year. And so those materials are part of it, as well as game builds and other things like that.
So in Astro's case, we have a different asset management system that's managing the digital assets. So, and we are still in the review process to look at should we consolidate everything, and then which will be the right solution to do that across both digital asset as well as the broadcast media.
A couple other questions for Dave? Yeah.
On your slide, you had I think the sort of MAE abstraction layer, and you had Lambda and other things. Do you think you're going serverless?
So we've made a pretty big jump into serverless for anything new that we're building. We're big fans of building Lambda. We're big fans of step functions. And so a lot of the stuff that we're building now is Node and sitting in Lambda. The obvious problem with asset management is the sort of runtimes for a lot of these things. So checksumming, Peter Jackson's 1.8 terabyte version of his last film is a little more than a 15-minute exercise.
Over on the right.
Yeah, so in the world of film, when you archive it, you can point a light through the projector and you can see the bits, even with 3-strike. What about protecting yourself from proprietary formats? Would then that checksum might be perfect, but there's compression and there's bit formats inside that. So what do you do? OpenEXR, DPX?
So it's an interesting question. So my boss happens to be here. We've had this debate several times. It is my assertion that we shouldn't convert for the sake of converting, because converting typically creates generational loss. So if I'm going to come out of a thing and go into a thing, I'm going to create generational loss in that scenario. But there is a very strong argument that says that when you bring materials in, you should go to OpenEXR. It depends a lot on where you want to, or another open format. It depends a lot on where you want to take the hit. You want to take it now and do a convert and do that generational loss when you may or may not need to actually solve for that problem for 20 years. Yeah, it has been, yeah, it is.
Particularly with tape.
Right. But the reality of a lot of things is there's certain formats that have died on the vine very quickly. But there's lots of formats that have been around forever and don't seem to ever want to die no matter how much we want them to.
Question here?
I was just going to ask, there's a big gap between checking every bit twice a year in the tape library and just what a lot of people do in Glacier and AWS, just put it away and assume that the 11.9s of durability are good. How do you feel about kind of making that move, and are you doing anything else to supplement the 11.9s that are purported to be there for the Malaysia side of things?
So this is a conversation that I literally had a day and a half ago or 2 days ago with Mike and a bunch of people from AWS. It really is a requirement for us to be able to confirm that our bits are good. And so it's gonna be important that the provider that provides the archive of storage for this archive is the amount of storage for this archive is able to provide visibility. I have a strong understanding that Amazon is doing that kind of work already. It's just a matter of them making that information available to us.
Yeah, so I can comment a little bit. I mean, as a provider of storage as a service, we traditionally would view that as housekeeping stuff that should be obscured from your view. But we also have, for example, the U.S. National Archive, second generation archive system is all in AWS, digital libraries, folks like that really, really care about having the transparency. And so we do not have a feature definition or a schedule for anything in this area at this time, but we're having lots of conversations about what it might look like, perhaps in a phased fashion. So maybe step one is providing transparency to what we already do, and we already do Fixity checks for bit rot against media or whatever we're using under the covers that we don't talk about. And then maybe further down the road would be things like on-demand Fixity checking using your particular algorithm. I mean, we'll be listening to all of you if you have inputs on how to prioritize those things.
Yeah, and from our point of view, just the availability, if the Fixity checking or the Fixity checking is being done, visibility to the output of that, whatever it happens to be, is great. I firmly believe that there's enough movement of materials going on inside of the archive, inside of the AWS storage layer, and there's enough desire by Amazon to do that and make sure that they're preserving bits correctly, that the work's getting done. It's just we need to see it. We trust but verify, right?
I mean, I mentioned our serverless media ingest solution that uses Lambda to calculate MD5. I mean, so we have ways of doing it at the solution level today in the short term. But yeah. And I want to toss out a couple questions, and you guys can queue up more questions for us. A question I had for Ek Chong is since you're kind of further along the path and you're already migrating data in, what were the biggest lessons learned? I mean, in hindsight, is there anything you would have done differently, or what thing jumped out at you as well? If we'd known this in advance, we might have.
Well, first it took us about 9 months to build on the business case and also to decide which design. And to be honest, there were a lot of back and forth with AWS when we were negotiating commercial, and it took them a long time also. But I think one of the key lessons learned was while we have put in place a 20 gig pipe for each site, and assuming based on that we are able to get content across quickly, what we didn't check, or at least we should have done a small migration test just to make sure we test the entire end-to-end chain to make sure we know where are the potential speed bumps. Because we do face a bit of speed bumps where even though we have a 20 gig pipe, we were having issues populating the whole 20 gig pipe. So there were fine-tuning we need to do to the servers we use to transfer the content. There were tape drive performance issues, and also even the glazier drivers or the adapters that was developed by the MEM providers. So it took a bit of fine-tuning for us to be able to increase the speed as well. So I think it will be good, I think, for anyone who is going to be embarking on this, at least test it on a small scale that you know where are the potential speed bumps. And there could be some that you cannot overcome it, but then you start running additional parallel processors. So for example, we are trying to save money, we are trying to use a bunch of old servers that we have. So we ended up, instead of having a couple of that doing the work, so we added a few more so that you could do parallel transfer.
We've had some experience with things like this too, and the thing that Ek Chong is alluding to is it's kind of like kicking the can down the road. So I solved this problem. Okay, I got enough throughput off my tape library, but now my disk isn't fast enough in order to intake and output materials. Okay, now I've done that, but my network layer is too, and it's just sort of chasing this can down the road, right? It's, so that end-to-end test is a great suggestion.
And one of my questions for David, actually, so you've obviously put a lot of thought into MAM software. In every one of these archive situations, we see a media asset manager, and oftentimes we'll see an HSM, right? What is the software that's actually writing to the underlying tape library? And the question is sort of 5-year vision. What does that industry look like? I mean, is there really a role for the traditional MAM and HSM? And if so, what is the thing that really matters most from those software layers?
So I think in this context, HSM solves, in traditional systems, solves a very specific problem, which is the sort of obfuscation of the file system from the overarching application. It was a real big problem for a long time for asset management systems to be able to talk to every kind of file system. So not that long ago, object storage wasn't a thing. It was a thought, but it wasn't a thing. And the sort of answer to the HSM is the RESTful endpoint. And so I think it's an evolution. You need less and less this standardized hierarchical storage manager interface that this tool can talk to, when you can instead have it talk to a standardized RESTful interface or something like a standardized RESTful interface. So the HSMs, I think, they're going to have a role for a long time, because we're going to have POSIX file systems and tape libraries and other things that need to be obfuscated from the DAM software. But this, like everything else, is moving in the direction of standardized endpoints that are developed against currently the RESTful style. And I think it becomes less and less important for HSMs to continue to exist in a lot of solutions, because this is all at the end of the day is about acquiring and retaining bits, and being able to get those things back in the other direction, and that's not necessarily a requirement when you have appropriate endpoints for that.
Yeah. I mean, similarly, like what I mentioned earlier, in our case, once we've fully migrated everything away from the storage tag library, we'll be shutting down both the library and the HSM as well, because the MEM vendors have actually built a driver leveraging on the Glazier SDK directly, that it could archive, it could retrieve content, it could perform checksum, all the necessary stuff that used to be done by a HSM system.
Right. And as vendors like AWS continue to extend and standardize the interfaces that we work with, it gets easier and easier to do that. I think the S3 put announcement for Glacier was big, right?
Yeah.
It's standardizing the way that you interface with Glacier through the S3 interface. So you don't have to go to the Glacier interface anymore, which means we're collapsing down the way we interact with storage, as far as AWS is concerned, to a smaller and smaller surface.
That's right. Yeah. Question over here on this side. Yeah.
So some bits are more valuable than others. Do you have different strategies for, let's say, user content versus movies?
That's a great question. You want to take it? All right. So we have an ongoing debate about that, and it's our preservation VP likes to talk about the 80-20 rule. When you get into making feature films, there's directors that will actually just leave the camera on all the time because it's free. Just leave it running, keep collecting bits, and so you end up in this scenario where you've got 100,000 photographs that were taken by on-set photographers across the course of a 9-month production, and some number that's approaching a bajillion hours of capture off of a multicam setup because they just left it running. That's absolutely a thing. But we were just talking about this the other day. The introduction of things like deep archive make that less important because it's closer now to being able to just put that thing on the shelf. Ideally, as a preservationist, you want to keep every piece of information that makes sense. You want to, it's hard to make a judgment about what's going to be good and what's not. An interesting example of that in our world is the idea of making calendars from Gone with the Wind. A 200,000 frame film. There's only so many images, unique images in that film. And so having additional material, set photography, other things like that, would make that, gives that business more legs, right? You don't end up running out of interesting materials.
I think we cater for both the broadcast quality material as well as user-generated content. And at the end, it depends on the life cycle of them. I think for the IPs that we generate on our own, so we take very good care of it. For IPs that we license from third party, obviously there's a life cycle for it, and after a certain time, then it gets purged. And for user-generated content, we actually have an in-house build system that we manage those separately as well. And basically, both of them have their own life cycle management.
Okay. Question here? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what do you do about encryption and, like, for instance, DCP KDMs? You need to kind of refresh over time. How do you deal with that in archives?
So storing an encrypted DCP maybe makes less sense than encrypting the DCP and then encrypting it on demand when you need to deliver it. Encryption process, it's actually another debate inside the studio about whether we should be saving encrypted DCPs or not. Typically when we deliver, we always want to look to do things like that, like re-encrypt those sorts of things if we need to, in the long term, right? We're not talking about in the window of delivery, because for us, content delivers in windows really aggressively, and then it goes away until somebody gets a brilliant idea. But for me to remake a DCP 5 years from now, it's pretty extraordinary, and it's usually for a new piece of content, right? Because DCP is not really an archival element; it's a servicing element. And so I can always remake DCPs. I can always re-encrypt DCPs, right?
So I guess that leads you. Are there a bunch of deliverable assets that you're considering just throwing away and just keeping them as a
So we actually manage, today we manage servicing assets differently than archive assets. They're actually, they're discrete. Now there are cases where servicing assets are actually archive assets. But as, as a standard matter, we're managing archive materials in a way, we're moving toward managing archive materials in a way that lets us regenerate the servicing materials if we need to. Right? We built some systems a number of years ago that moved us very, very strongly into just-in-time servicing, and that was really successful for us. And so that model continues to stay. So we want to be in a position where we can have the master asset and regenerate if we need to down the road. Because the reality of me, again, reservicing a DCP down the road means that we're re-releasing a feature film somewhere in a theater, and that's just not a thing that happens a lot.
I think there was one question over here, and then maybe one more question, and we'll wrap it up. Okay.
Your archiving solution is probably a pretty sort of closed ecosystem. When you think about business opportunity for content delivery, what are the business opportunities to deliver, to leverage your archiving material and solution, also for content delivery going forward, OTT platforms, B2B business, sort of sharing the assets that you're having in your archive in a B2B fashion? What are the opportunities that you see to do that?
So I think it's actually, at this point, it's pretty unrealistic for us to think about servicing that archive asset directly, because it often ends up in a state that we wouldn't want to necessarily make. And I don't mean it's in a bad state. I just mean it's not really in a usable state from for a third party. Having a stack, a 2 terabyte, 3 terabyte, 5 terabyte, 100 terabyte stack of OpenEXR images that I send to a downstream recipient is not particularly usable. But the expectation is essentially that we will monetize that stuff by, but we'll have to condition it before it gets used. Does that answer the question?
No, for a broadcaster, they might take a slightly different view of that. Or do you have plans to directly kind of repurpose assets, or do you have new business models in mind for?
So for us, because we store in the format that is for broadcast purpose, and for our OTT service, basically we just pull straight out from the archive and then create the mezzanine file on the fly to supply either to our for viewing through our OTT applications or through our video on demand service that we offer through our connected set-top box. So basically we are accessing content directly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Follow-up question on that though. So for the original content that you create, the original camera files, are you archiving those in this solution?
At the moment, not yet. So at the moment, this is only catering for content that's ready for the pay TV business. Yeah. I think it's still a process that we are going through, and there are still pockets of areas that we have not really finalized. How do we put it into the archive?
All right, last question, because we're out of time.
Okay, I think it's might be more a question for Chong. So we're a systems integrator and managed service provider. We have several broadcasters as customers, and some of them have concerns about working with Amazon, as Amazon also is operating Amazon Prime, which is competing for the same eyeballs. So is that playing some kind of role in your relationship with Amazon? There's no concern at all.
Obviously, there's some concern, but it's not such a big concern at the moment. And like what I mentioned earlier, we focus a lot in originating our own local content, and that's an area that I think someone like Amazon or Netflix may not necessarily be focusing, especially in our region yet. And at the end, I think you need to work with someone, right? Whether it's Amazon or someone else, potentially either you could have your own direct broadcast or media related service, or someone else could be hosting other competitors as well, right?
All right, so we're out of time. We'll take more questions when we step down from the stage, but I want to give these guys a hand, so thanks for coming. Great to have your input.